underweight babies. Well, this is interesting, but maybe this is a white uniforms on a Tuesday thing. Maybe this is a statistical anomaly. It's not the worst explanation, frankly. And I did this study back in 2011, but then a few interesting things happened. 2012, a friend of mine in Spain did a study looking, and he found that women with more greenness, and they measured this, wasn't just trees, within 100 meters of their homes had higher birth weights. So consistent results. 2013, a team in Southern California found that women with more tree canopy within 50 meters of their homes had higher birth weights. Consistent results. 2014, a team in Germany found that mothers with more greenness within 500 meters of their homes had higher birth weight. Again, consistent results. 2014 again, a team in Canada found that women with more greenness within 100 meters of their homes had higher birth weights. This is an interesting one because the guy who did it, the lead author, told me to his face he thought my study in 2011 was bullshit and he went out to disprove it and he ended up confirming it. So, what can I say? Yeah. So I was pretty happy about that one. He was nice enough to tell me that stuff. So that was fun. I could actually go on at a really tedious length. Since my paper was published in 2011, there's been at least 30 studies that have found a link between greenness and maternal and birth weight. Now, could one study be an anomaly? Sure, absolutely. Could 30 studies be an anomaly? Yeah, but it's a lot less likely. Now let's just take a moment and imagine that I have a healthy weight baby in this hand and an underweight baby in this hand. That the difference between the two might be a mother's exposure to trees during pregnancy. That's something very profound about our relationship with trees. This is a really important stuff. Because if you're born underweight or premature, you're much more likely to have health complications or die. And to some degree, you get put on a health trajectory for life. Kids who are born underweight or premature, they're less likely to do well in school. They have lower lifetime earnings, for example. So you really, if they can be avoided by something as cheap as a tree, this is a really good thing. Now, I think the link between trees and birth outcomes is interesting, although, I would say that. But it also highlights one of the biggest headaches when you're studying the health benefits of trees, what I call the nice tree, nice neighborhood effect. That is, where are the nice trees? They're in the neighborhoods which are whiter, wealthier, and better educated. And we absolutely know that race, education, and income are important drivers of health. So that's kind of a problem, because you've got these three things in the sort of a triangle. You've got your trees, you've got your health, and your demography. And you really want to just look at trees and health, but you have this sort of three-sided thing, and you take statistical steps to try and account for the demography, but you can never be absolutely sure that you've done everything. And about 12 years or so ago, I was really bothered by this problem when I realized I could flip my hypothesis on its head. That is, if trees are good for you, which is my general hypothesis, then killing them should be bad for you. Right? Why is that such a grand revelation, or at least for me, passes for a grand revelation? Well, because it opens up some new methodological approaches, because trees can die a lot quicker than they can grow. So you can look at large changes in tree canopy in a short period of time, in a way that you can't if you're going to bore yourself to death waiting for the things to grow, okay? But, and the other thing is, trees at one point in time, like in this neighborhood, are related to race, education, and income. But tree loss over time need not be, could be, but it need not be. There's nothing to say that tree loss over time has to be correlated with race or educational income. So maybe looking at tree loss is an interesting way. Maybe it's a way of kind of sidelining those pesky demographics, and really isolating that relationship between trees and health. Okay, but to do this, you would need two conditions. One, you'd have to have something that kills a lot of trees in a short amount of time, because certainly, a few trees dying isn't going to have a measurable impact on health. And you'd also need to make sure that the loss of trees wasn't correlated with race, education, or income. What could do that? Well, this handsome little chap could. Anybody know who this is? This is the emerald ash borer. Just arrived on the west coast, 2022. And if we're all going to get very familiar with him, unfortunately, this is what he can do. This is Toledo, Ohio in 2006. This is the same street 3 years later. So horrific. So clearly, it can kill plenty of trees in a short amount of time. So that first condition holds. But does the pattern in tree loss, is that correlated with race, education, income? Well, let's look at this little map. It shows it spreading from Detroit in 2002 for 20 years till it was arrived in Oregon in 2022. And as you're watching this spread, can you imagine, is this the sort of pattern where you would get a change in race or education or income? It's not really. Demographics don't change this way. And you don't have to take my word for that. I've run the stats, and what you find here is that this spread of emerald ash borer and the loss of trees is uncorrelated with race and education or income. So it's a real statistical gift. So if we do see a relationship between this loss of trees and health, it's much less likely to be caused by other things. That was a rather belabored explanation, so I will stop all the stats nonsense now. So what type of, I looked at 2 causes of death in this study. I looked at cardiovascular and lower respiratory disease. Why did I look at those? Well, they're important. They're the first and third biggest killers in this country. And the other thing is, there's good reason to think that trees and them could be related. Right? So there's multiple mechanisms that link trees, cardiovascular and lower respiratory disease. And in this case, I looked at county level mortality. These black squares are US counties. I looked at counties from 1990 through 2007. So you have this 12 years without EAB, you add it in, you wait 6 years, and you see what happens. And what happens is, in counties infested with emerald ash borer, higher rates of cardiovascular and low respiratory mortality. And interestingly, as an infestation progressed, as more trees died, more people died. So you saw this dose-response relationship. More trees dying, more people dying, which is what you would expect to happen. We also saw that emerald ash borer had a bigger effect in wealthier counties. Why would that be? Correct. More trees in those wealthy counties, providing greater benefits. What happens when we take them away? Bigger negative health impacts. So that's what we saw. Sorry, I got myself a little, I need to catch up here. Oh, there we go. So across 6 years in 15 states, we found that emerald ash borer infestation was associated with an additional 15,000 deaths from cardiovascular disease and 6,000 from lower respiratory disease. So an additional 21,000 deaths. This is not trivial numbers. This is a lot of dead people who didn't have to die. Now, I think the results from the EAB study are compelling for the reasons that I outlined. Again, I'm hardly neutral, but in the years since I did this study, I've wondered whether the opposite was true. That is, if killing trees leads to higher rates of cardiovascular and lower respiratory disease, should planting trees lead to lower rates? One would think, right? But, as I outlined earlier, the problem is trees are really tedious. They take a really long time to grow. I take a sort of personal affront at this. And so you would need years or decades of planting data. And I didn't know where to get these sort of data. And I'd kind of given up on the idea of doing a companion study. And then probably 4 or 5 years ago, I just happened to be talking to a colleague who works for a Portland-based non-profit called Friends of Trees. Some of you may be familiar with them, great organization. And she mentioned, oh yeah, we've planted 50,000 trees since 1990, and we have the date and the address where every single one was planted. I couldn't believe it. Bless them, they just happen to be really fastidious record keepers. For no particular reason. They just were. And then I sort of tried to casually ask, do you mind if can I? He said, sure, absolutely. So they gave me access to their data, which was wonderful of them. Again, great organization. And so I had to then get health data to go with that. And I contacted the Oregon Health Authority and and got access to census tract level mortality data. For those of you who don't know, census tracts are just geographic units used by the US Census. And tracts, there's 140 of them in Portland, so they're roughly the size of a named neighborhood. So in this study, we can just think of this as we're looking at the relationship between trees and neighborhood level mortality. And we looked at just 2 tree variables, just how many trees have been planted in the last 15 years, that's just the total number of trees, and then we looked at the number of trees planted in 5 age bands, 1 to 5 years ago, 6 to 10, 11 to 15. Why was that? Because in advance, before we ever collected any data, you would expect as trees age and grow that the benefits would get greater. I mean, you would think. For example, as a tree gets bigger, it's going to intercept more air pollution, going to provide more shade. So if you don't see that in the data, then maybe things aren't going the way you think they are. So it's always good to be, as a scientist, and not go easy on yourself. You know, it's important to check. You can sometimes just ask one question and get impressed with your data and call it good. And it's a temptation not to do that. So, let's get to the results. This table just shows there was 5 variables in my model. And in this case, we looked at neighborhood level non-accidental mortality. Why non-accidental? Because there's no way that trees are going to affect accidental death. Right? There's no mechanism linking trees and accidental death. So we just throw those out. And in common with a lot of green health studies, we just looked at non-accidental mortality. And we found that in neighborhoods where the income was higher, there was significantly lower mortality. Again, not surprising. You see this in public health studies all the time. If you want to live longer, get wealthier. Definitely, it has a depressing effect on income, has a depressingly powerful effect on mortality. Age. Neighborhoods where people were older, unsurprisingly, there's higher mortality. Again, not stop the precious stuff. Education, higher education, lower mortality, as we would expect. Race, it was mildly surprising, that wasn't significant. There's a couple of reasons for that, I suspect. One, income and education are already in the model, so to some extent they account for race. And the other thing is, Portland's just one of the whitest cities in the country. There just isn't very much variation. So I suspect that's what's going on there. So what about trees? They're the ones, that's the variable we care about. Well, we found that neighborhoods with more tree planting in the last 15 years have significantly lower non-accidental mortality. Now that's great, but you really need 2 things. You want something that's statistically significant, but it has to be big enough to care about. If I say, oh, there was a statistically significant effect, and every 10,000 trees, 0.00013 lives were saved, you're like, oh, okay, not great news. So, how big was the effect? Well, we found that, on average, Friends of Trees planted 1,638 trees a year. 1,638. And that was associated with 15.6 fewer deaths. That's not nothing. Another way to look at this is roughly 1 life death was averted for every 100 trees planted. Which I think is a pretty good deal, and we're going to return to that in a second. So now let's look at how trees age and grow. So what I did in this part of the study is just, let's take those 1,638 trees, and then let's wait 1 to 5 years after planting, and see how many deaths are averted. In this case, 11.6 across the whole city. Okay, then let's wait 5 more years till they grow a little longer, 19.7 fewer deaths, and then a little longer still, 23.1 fewer deaths. So, as the trees get older, you see we have a bigger impact on mortality, which is what we were hoping to see, and so what we did see. You see a graph like this. The effect goes up, but a sort of declining rate, which is, again, what you would anticipate in advance. Now, we didn't just look at non-accidental mortality, we also looked at cardiovascular and lower respiratory disease, because we remember this, I sort of skipped over this, but this was meant to be a partner study to the Emerald Ash Borer study. And that one looked at cardiovascular and lower respiratory disease, so let's see what we can find there. And we found in this case that neighborhoods with more trees planted in the last 15 years had significantly lower rates of cardiovascular disease. So consistent with the Enrolashport study. With low respiratory disease, it was more marginal. At the 5% level, it wasn't significant, it just about was at the 10%, but really the strongest relationship there was with the cardiovascular disease. So, what does that tell you? I think, and the other thing to note here, in both of these two studies, is both show dose-response relationship. In the Enrolashport case, as more trees died, more people died. And in the tree growth study, as trees aged and grow, you saw a bigger impact on mortality. So both had a relationship with cardiovascular disease and both showed a dose-response relationship. Right? So that's remarkable. For those of you who aren't scientists, that's a really unusual thing, to have studies that are that consistent. These are different, they were conducted 9 years apart, different study areas, different measures of tree loss, different statistical models, very different studies, and yet they're consistent results. And what does that tell you? I think that tells you that taken together, these studies really strengthen the statistical evidence that trees are associated with lower mortality. So I've just got a few minutes left here, so now I'm just going to talk about one final thing. Because we were doing a specific thing here, tree planting, we're able to do a cost-benefit analysis. I'm an economist by training, so I can't help myself. And to do this, we made two assumptions. One, we assumed that the annual planting and maintenance cost of a tree was $58.70. This is from a 2005 study. We adjusted it for inflation. And then we also, so if we multiply that by 140, so we plant one tree in each of Portland's 140 neighborhoods, that's $8,218. But how do we work out the benefits of saving lives? Well, it turns out the EPA has to do this all the time. I don't want to get into the details, but what they assume is the value of saving us, what they call one statistical life, is $10.7 million. We could have a whole talk just about that number. So if you, just for the time being, take that number, I found in my study that planting one tree in each of Portland's 140 neighborhoods would save 1.33 lives. If we multiply that by 10.7, we get $14.2 million. So that's a benefit-cost ratio of 1,727 to 1. Right, even those Nigerian email scams we used to get didn't offer sort of flamboyant results like this. It's quite amazing results. So really, what's the take-home message? And that is that loss of trees or increased impervious surface may have a negative impact on the health of residents of Seattle, and that the magnitude here may not be trivial. That the effect of losing significant amounts of particularly mature canopy will have non-trivial effects on health. So, I have a thing for the questions. Now, we're not going to have questions now, but I just put it up. So, see my contact information and a very, very adorable dog. So, there you go. Thank you for your time.